She dismissed exactly one person too many, and the empire she had spent 11 years building began to dissolve inside a single night. The woman she dismissed was not a lieutenant, not a strategist, not anyone whose title would have warned her. She was a waitress, 43 years old, quiet in the particular way that very observant people are quiet, just to say not quiet at all, only still. Her name was Soo Yun, and the morning she did not come back, three of the most powerful criminal organizations operating along the eastern seaboard began one by one to place their calls. But the woman who had dismissed her was called Madame Jin, and a man who had known Madame Jin for 9 years, a man who ran a competing operation out of a cold warehouse district 3 cities north, said 7 words to her on the phone that first morning. 7 words only. He said you never watched how she watched everything. Then he hung up. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Madame Jin was standing in the center of her private dining room when she heard those 7 words, and the room was, as it always was, immaculate. Black lacquered table, 8 chairs that no one ever used except by invitation. A single orchid in a narrow glass vase at the table's center, white and precisely tended, replaced every 4 days by a florist who came before dawn and left without speaking. The walls were pale gray, lit from below by fixtures set into the floor, which meant the light always traveled upward, which meant every person who entered that room was lit from beneath, which meant Madame Jin saw their faces the way a portrait painter sees a subject. She had chosen the lighting deliberately. She had chosen everything in that room deliberately. She was in most observable respects a woman of extraordinary deliberateness, and she had confused that deliberateness with wisdom for so long that the confusion had become structural. It was built into the walls. It was in the lighting. The diner was called Changwon. It sat on the ground floor of a narrow building 3 blocks from the waterfront, in a part of the city where the streets were wide enough for 2 delivery trucks to pass each other without either slowing, and where the smell of salt and diesel was so constant that people who worked there stopped noticing it within a week. The diner had operated under various names for 30 years before Madame Jin acquired the building in the 7th year of her operation, and she had renamed it and had it refitted with new counters and new lighting and new floor tile in a pale celadon green that she had chosen from a catalog. She had not asked Soo-yeon what she thought of the tile. Soo-yeon had been working the diner's floor since 2 years before Madame Jin acquired it, which meant she knew the building the way a person knows a body, knew which floorboard clicked under the 3rd booth from the left, knew that the service entrance door swelled in humidity and needed to be shouldered open, knew that the corner booth by the west window collected cold air from a gap in the frame that no contractor had ever fully sealed, a gap perhaps a centimeter wide that admitted a thin thread of outside air and made that booth colder than any other seat in the building on a winter night. Soo-yeon had never reported these things because no one had asked her. She had simply managed them. She kept a small wedge of folded cardstock in her apron pocket in the winter months and pressed it into the gap in the window frame when she arrived for her shift and removed it when she left. Madame Jin did not know about the cardstock. She had never been told about the gap. The diner operated in 2 modes that existed simultaneously and invisibly alongside each other. In the first mode, it was a working diner, open from 6 in the morning until 2 in the morning, serving a menu of simple Korean dishes alongside the kind of American diner food that the neighborhood had expected since before Madame Jin arrived. Short rib soup, rice, a banchan spread that changed by season, alongside eggs and toast and coffee strong enough to hold a spoon upright. Soo-yeon worked the floor from 5 in the afternoon until close 5 nights a week, and had done so for 9 years. In the second mode, the diner's back room, accessible through a door behind the service counter that appeared to be a supply closet, functioned as the neutral meeting ground for 6 of the 11 affiliated organizations that operated under the loose cooperative that Madame Jin had spent 11 years assembling. The back room had 4 chairs, a table, a phone that connected to nothing outside the building, and a set of procedures for requesting access that Suyin administered, because Suyin was the only person in the building every night it was open. And because the procedure required a human being who could not be hurried and could not be read and could not be pressured, Madame Jin had given Suyon this function not as a recognition of her capacities, but as a convenience. The most convenient person had been Suyon. That was how Madame Jin had thought of it. Convenient. It was a word that would return to her later with the precision of a blade. Suyon had departed on a Tuesday. More precisely, Suyuan had worked her full shift on Monday, had cleaned and closed the diner at 2 in the morning with the same completeness she brought to every close, had placed the cardstock wedge in the window gap of the corner booth because the temperature that night had dropped to 4 degrees, had set the chairs upside down on the tables, had balanced the register, had written the inventory note for the morning supplier in her small vertical handwriting, and had then set a sealed envelope on Madame Jin's desk in the small office adjacent to the back room. The envelope was addressed in the same small vertical handwriting. It read, "For Madame Jin, to be read Tuesday morning," and then Suyan had walked out of the building and had not come back. Madame Jin had not read the envelope Tuesday morning. She had a breakfast meeting at 7, a property discussion at 9, and a call at 11 with a man in Vancouver who controlled 3 port operations and whose cooperation she had been cultivating for 14 months. She did not arrive at the diner until nearly noon, and she picked up the envelope from her desk without immediately opening it, because she was on the phone as she entered the office, and she set the envelope aside and forgot it for another 40 minutes. When she finally opened it, she read it standing up, still half attending to a secondary thought about the Vancouver call, and what she read was this: "I am leaving. The ledger in the green cabinet is complete through last night and balanced. The access protocols for the back room are written in the blue folder in the second drawer. The supplier contact list is updated. The 3 outstanding access requests are noted with the relevant background. I have left nothing undone that I was responsible for. I have left something for you to find, but you will need to look for it, and you will need to look with more attention than you have generally given this building. I hope you will look. Some things depend on it. S." Madame Jin read it twice. Then she set it down, and her first complete thought was not alarm. Her first complete thought was irritation. The irritation of a person who has had to confront unexpectedly the small operational gap created by the departure of a resource they had assumed was permanent. She thought, "I will need to find someone for the floor by Thursday." She thought, "I should have the back room procedures reviewed." She thought, only as a secondary consideration, why would she leave without notice? And then she thought, well, people leave. She made 3 calls over the next 2 hours, none of them to Suyin, and the first sign that the situation was not what she had assessed it to be arrived at 3:15 that same Tuesday afternoon, when a man named Park, who represented the Northern Waterfront operation within the cooperative and who had worked with Madame Jin for 7 years, called to say that he was placing the cooperative's Northern membership under a 90-day review. He was not aggressive about it. He was courteous in the way that precise people are courteous, which is to say, he said only what was necessary and nothing that could be retracted. He said, "We heard about the change at Cheong. We want to understand what it means for access. We'll be in touch." Then he was gone. Madame Jin stood very still after that call, the kind of stillness that is not calm. By 5 o'clock Tuesday, 2 more calls had come. both from affiliated operations, both expressing variants of the same concern: a change in personnel at Shangwan, a desire to understand continuity, a polite withdrawal of pending commitments. By 6, a real estate transaction that had been coordinated through the cooperative and that required the formal consent of 4-member operations had stalled, one consent having been quietly retracted without explanation. By 9 that evening, Madame Jin had stopped answering her phone directly and was routing calls through her personal assistant, a young man named Dae-yoon, who was efficient and loyal and completely unable to explain why 6 organizations that had treated Madame Jin's word as sufficient for 11 years were now asking procedural questions they had never asked. Before the answer, as Madame Jin would come to understand it, was Su-yeon, not Su-yeon as an abstraction. Su-yeon as a specific practice, the practice of sitting with a person in the corner booth in the cold that the cardstock wedge never fully eliminated, and asking them what they needed before they knew they needed to say it. Su-yeon had run the access protocol for the back room for 7 years. In that time, she had personally received 214 individuals on behalf of the cooperative. She had served all of them coffee and, in many cases, food. She had remembered every preference. She had never disclosed a preference. She had never leveraged a preference. She had simply held the knowledge the way a very deep vessel holds water, with no intention of spilling and no need to reference the volume. The trust the cooperative had placed in Chungwon was not, as it turned out, trust in Madame Jin's building. It was trust in the person who held the door. And the person who held the door was gone. Wednesday morning, Madame Jin arrived at the diner at 5:30, before the morning staff, and stood alone in it with the lights still low. The kitchen lights were on, the deep amber of fluorescent tubes not yet warmed, and they cast the space in something between gold and brown that made the celadon floor tile look gray. She walked the floor. She had not walked the floor of her own diner, she realized, without purpose, without moving toward something or away from something, in perhaps 4 years. She walked it now. She stood at the service counter. She stood in the corner booth and immediately felt the cold thread of air from the gap in the west window frame, a cold so specific and located that it was almost like a pointing finger. She looked at the gap. She saw the folded cardstock wedge on the window ledge where Su-yeon had left it after her last shift. She picked it up. It was a small square of cardstock, folded twice, the kind of thing that cost nothing and weighed nothing, and had been sitting 2 feet from Madame Jin every time she had taken a meeting in that booth, for years without her ever knowing it was there. She held it in her palm for a long moment, a piece of folded cardstock. A draft stopped. A person who had simply noticed and acted and not reported the noticing, because there was no mechanism for reporting, and because the action was its own completion, she set it back on the ledge. Then she went to the back room and read the blue folder Su-yeon had left, and then the green cabinet ledger. And then she sat in one of the 4 chairs in the back room and understood, with a clarity that felt very much like being cold, that she did not know how much of what she had built had been held together not by her arrangements but by someone else's attention. The letter had said, "I have left something for you to find. But you will need to look for it, and you will need to look with more attention than you have generally given this building." Madame Jin looked. She began with the diner itself. She found in the supply closet a small lockbox she did not recognize, set behind a stack of linen napkins on the lowest shelf. It was not locked. Inside was an envelope, and inside the envelope was a single index card, and on the index card was written, "The woman at the dry goods supplier on Chungro-gil. Ask her for the blue ledger she is keeping for a friend. She will know you are the one to ask when you tell her the booze number." Below that, a 7-digit number, not a phone number, the count of something. Madame Jin looked at it for a long time before she understood that it was a currency amount. In a denomination that made her sit down, she drove to the dry goods supplier on Chungrogil that same morning. It was a narrow shop that sold rice and dried goods and a small selection of imported items, and it was run by a woman in her 60s who wore her hair in a tight braid and who regarded Madame Jin with the particular assessment of someone who has been told to expect a specific kind of person and is measuring whether what has arrived matches the description. Madame Jin told her the booth number. The woman nodded once and went to the back and came out carrying a blue ledger. A proper accounting ledger with a cloth cover and a ribbon marker, and she set it on the counter. Then she said, to tell you that she finished it in March and waited to see if you would find it. She said she waited 6 months. She also said to give you this. And the woman set a second sealed envelope on the counter beside the ledger. On the front of the envelope, Su-yeon's vertical handwriting. Read the ledger first. Madame Jin took both items and sat in her car in the gray morning light. The ledger documented in precise and dated entries 11 months of financial misdirection conducted through the cooperative shared accounts. The entries were dry and factual in the way that only a person with no personal stake in the drama of what they are recording can be dry and factual. Dates, account numbers, amounts routed, the destination accounts. The name attached to the routing decisions. The name was Choi Woo-jin, who was Madame Jin's director of operations, who had worked for her for 8 years, who had been in every measurable and observable way her most effective and most trusted lieutenant, who had called her 2 days before Su-yeon's departure to express concern about a competitor and to recommend a specific countermove, a recommendation Madame Jin had followed. Who had, the ledger now suggested, manufactured the competitor concern as a displacement so that a specific account transfer would move without Madame Jin's attention. The total amount redirected across the 11 months of entries in the blue ledger was 462 million won, the 7-digit number on Su-yeon's index card. Madame Jin had looked at it in the supply closet and not been able to name the amount it described. Now she could name it. She sat with the ledger open on her steering wheel and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific vertigo of understanding that the floor beneath you is not the floor you thought it was. She opened the second envelope. It contained 2 items. The first was a single sheet of paper with 4 dates, 4 account numbers, and 4 names, representing the institutions to which the redirected funds had been moved in stages, each institution in a different jurisdiction. A chain of transfers, clean and deliberate, prepared by someone who had expected to need it. The second item was another index card. It read, "I noticed this in October. I did not bring it to you because you would have asked Woo-jin to look into it and Woo-jin would have found the ledger before it was complete. I needed 11 months. The ledger is now complete. You have everything you need. What you do with it is yours to decide." There is one more stop. The map is folded into the back cover of the ledger. A small map, drawn by hand, showing a drive of approximately 340 kilometers, terminating at a city on the coast that Madame Jin had visited twice in her life, both times for operational reasons, both times without pleasure. Days had passed. It was Thursday now, 4 days since Monday's last shift, and the cooperative's northern membership was still formally under review, and the real estate transaction was still stalled. And Choi Woo-jin had come to work each of those days and had sat in his office 3 doors from Madame Jin's and had continued performing competence with a fluency so complete that Madame Jin had watched him in meetings and understood for the first time what it looks like when a person is not present in what they are doing. The eyes are there, the voice is there, the intelligence is there, but the orientation is elsewhere. She had not seen this before because she had not looked at it with the question she was now holding. She had not told him about the ledger. She had told no one about the ledger. She had the box in the trunk of her car. She drove back to the diner each morning and sat in the corner booth with the cold thread of air on her left cheek and thought. On Friday morning, she called a man named Ryu. Ryu was a private investigator who had done work for the cooperative for 4 years, who reported to no one inside the organization, who was known to Madame Jin only by a phone number and a set of Dropbox protocols and a record of having been exactly right on 6 of the 6 occasions she had employed him. She had never met him in person. She told him what she had. She read him the 4 destination account institutions from the index card. She gave him Choi Woo-jin's name. She asked him to do 2 things: establish the current state of those accounts and establish what Woo-jin's next move was likely to be. Ryu said, "How much time do you want this to take?" Madame Jin said as little as possible. Ryu said, "Then I'll call you when I'm done." And he was. She drove the 340 kilometers on Saturday. The route took her first east along the industrial corridor where the highway was elevated and the city spread beneath it, in a flat arrangement of rooftops and tank farms and dry loading docks, and then south as the landscape opened into something more tentative, lower and wider, the sky larger, the road quieter. She had not driven this distance alone in years. She had a driver. She had assistants. She had a structure of staffed intermediation between herself and the direct experience of moving through the world. And now she was in a plain rental sedan with her own hands on the wheel, watching the kilometer markers pass. And the passage of each marker had a quality she recognized only gradually, which was the quality of measuring something she had spent 11 years not measuring. The distance between who she had been deciding she was and who she had actually been, it was not a comfortable arithmetic. She arrived in the coastal city in the late afternoon. The light was angled and salt white, the kind of afternoon light that exists only near water in the autumn, and it struck every surface at an angle that eliminated shadow and made the whole scene look examined. She followed the hand-drawn map to a street of low buildings near the harbor, and to a small restaurant at the end of the street, and she parked and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the restaurant's window and the warm light inside it. The window held one small table. Soo-yin was sitting at it. She was drinking tea and reading, and she did not look up when Madame Jin parked, and she did not look up when Madame Jin crossed the street, and she did not look up when Madame Jin pushed open the restaurant door and stood in the doorway with the salt air still on her coat. She looked up when Madame Jin sat down across from her. She looked up with the unhurried assessment of someone who had already decided how they felt about this moment and therefore did not need to perform any feeling about it. She said, "You found it," Madame Jin said. "It took me 3 days to understand what the cardstock was for." Soo-yin looked at her for a moment. "That long." Yes. Soo-yin set her book down, face down, open to her page. She did not close it. She intended, this gesture communicated, to go back to it. "The cardstock has been there for 7 winters. Every night I worked. I know that now. What else do you know?" Madame Jin placed the blue ledger on the table between them. Soo-yin did not touch it. She had made it. She knew what was in it. "I know about Woo Jin," Madame Jin said. "The 4 accounts, the 11 months. I know it was finished in March and that you waited 6 months to see if I would find it myself." "Did you know?" "I found your letter." Soo-yin nodded. Once small, the nod of a person filing information without judgment. "I didn't think you would find it yourself, but I thought you should have had the chance." Silence settled between them, the particular silence of a coastal town on an autumn afternoon, where the wind comes in intervals and between intervals the quiet is absolute. Madame Jin looked at Soo-yin's face, which was rested in a way she had not seen it in years, or perhaps in a way she had never looked closely enough to observe. She looked as though several weights had been set down somewhere, and she had not yet decided whether to pick them up again. Madame Jin said, "Why didn't you come to me with it directly, in October?" Suyeon said, because in October, if I had come to you with evidence against Woo Jin, you would have asked him to respond to it, and he would have discredited me, and I would have been gone with nothing, and he would still be there. I needed the ledger complete. I needed the chain to the 4 accounts, documented and jurisdictionally distributed. I needed it to be something that could not be quietly explained away by a trusted man to a woman who trusted him. The word trusted landed without drama and with considerable weight. Madame Jin did not flinch at it. She let it land. And if I had never found the trail... Suyeon was quiet for a moment. Then I had already made a second set of the ledger and arranged for it to go to the Financial Crimes Unit of the Provincial Authority through a separate channel. In approximately 30 days from when I left if you hadn't come. She paused. I was not going to let it go. The people who were harmed by those redirections were not large institutions. 3 of them were small affiliated operations. Families. People who thought they were protected by the cooperative and who were being quietly drained. I was not going to let that continue regardless of what you decided. The protecting of the innocent as a baseline, as a floor below which no other consideration applied. Madame Jin heard it and understood, in that hearing, the specific difference between a person who runs an operation and a person who pays attention to what the operation is actually doing to human beings. Suyeon had paid attention. I understand, Madame Jin said, and she did. That was the uncomfortable part. She told Suyeon about Ryu's call, which had come Friday night. Woo Jin had moved 2 of the 4 accounts into a single consolidated position in the preceding 48 hours, which meant he was preparing for a withdrawal. More significantly, Ryu had found that Woo Jin had, in the past 2 weeks, been in contact with 2 of the cooperative's wavering members, specifically the 2 whose review calls had come in earliest. He had positioned himself quietly and with characteristic precision, not as someone fleeing, but as someone offering continuity. He was presenting himself as the stable alternative to an increasingly uncertain Madame Jin. He was not running. He was moving sideways, into the space the cooperative's uncertainty had opened. Suyeon listened to this without visible alarm. She said, "How long before he moves?" Ryu thinks 72 hours before the account consolidation completes and the funds become portable. After that, he has everything he needs to establish independently. Then you have 72 hours to make the ledger institutional. Yes. What do you need from me, madam? Jin said. I need your name on the submission. The ledger is your work, and a submission without your direct attribution will be questioned. I need your signature on the formal disclosure, and I need you to give a recorded account to the financial authority. I cannot do this with you absent from it. Suyeon looked at the table for a moment. She looked at the blue ledger, which was her 11 months of quiet and meticulous work, assembled in a diner back room between access procedures and supply orders and the management of a draft she had sealed with a piece of folded cardstock. She said, "You're asking me to come back. I am asking you to complete what you built. After that, what you do is yours." Suyeon looked out the window at the harbor. The afternoon light was going, now shifting into the particular mauve of a coastal autumn dusk, the water turning from silver to pewter. She said, "I'll give the account. I'll sign the submission. I'm not coming back to Seongwon. Not to the same arrangement." Madame Jin said, "What arrangement would you come back to?" And Suyeon turned from the window and said, "One where I am asked what I think. One where the decisions about the space I work in are made with my knowledge. One where what I know is treated as information rather than coincidence. And a formal role, not a favor, not a convenience. A role with a name and a function and a weight inside the organization equal to what I have been carrying without acknowledgement." She said it plainly, without force, the way a person states something they have had a long time to decide. If you can offer that, actually offer it, not perform it for a quarter and then return to what you prefer. Then we can discuss Chingwon, Madame Jean said. I can offer it, Suyon said. I know you believe that right now. I'm going to need more than your current belief. They worked through the night, the two of them and Ryu, by phone, and the phone calls went to the financial authorities' overnight intake, which was a mechanism designed specifically for time-sensitive submissions involving ongoing financial crimes in progress. The submission went in at 11:40 that night, formally attributed, digitally signed by Suyan from the coastal restaurant's table with the harbor dark outside the window. The four account institutions were notified under the applicable cross-jurisdictional framework by 7 the following morning, all four of them in different provinces, and therefore all four notified simultaneously and without the possibility of one notification alerting the others first. The consolidated account Wu Jin had been building toward was frozen at 6:52 in the morning, 14 minutes before the transfer window he had arranged would have opened. Wu Jin arrived at the diner that Sunday morning at 9, which was unusual. He did not work Sundays. He let himself in with the key he still had and walked to Madame Jin's office and found her sitting at her desk with the door open. He stood in the doorway. He was composed. He was always composed. He was a man for whom composure was not a discipline, but a design feature. And for 8 years, Madame Jin had read his composure as fidelity. Now she read it as architecture. A constructed exterior maintained at all times, because an unconstructed exterior would have revealed the orientation beneath. She said, "Sit down, Wu Jin." He sat. He had assessed the room in the half-second before sitting, and she saw him assess it, saw the calculation moving behind the composure, saw him locate that no one else was present, and calculate what that meant for his options. He said, "I heard you were at the financial authority. You heard quickly. I hear things." "Yes," Madame Jin said. "So did Suyin." The composure held almost. Suyin is a waitress. 6 words, she counted them. She would count them many times afterward, not because they were unusual, but because they were the truest expression of the specific failure she had been conducting herself. Suyan is a waitress. She had thought it too. Not in those words, not stated, but structurally, functionally. She had arranged her world in accordance with that belief. And here was the same belief delivered by a man who had stolen 462 million, one under the shelter of it. She said, "The accounts are frozen. The submission names you and the 4 institutions. The Provincial Financial Authority has the original ledger and a full recorded account. There are 3 partner operations in the cooperative who were directly harmed by the redirections. Their representatives were informed this morning with documentation. You won't find the 2 members you approached in the past 2 weeks willing to shelter you. They were also informed." Wu Jin sat with this for a moment. He said, "What do you want? I want you to resign today. I want the resignation letter to be specific about your departure being voluntary and permanent. I want the letter in my hand before you leave this building. And in exchange, I give you the time between now and when the formal prosecution moves, which I cannot control and do not intend to. What you do with that time is your own construction." He wrote the letter. He wrote it at Madame Jin's desk on plain paper with a pen he took from the desk cup, and he wrote it without visible emotion, which was consistent with everything else about him, and he slid it across the desk and stood and left the office. And Madame Jin heard the service entrance door open and close and the slight difficulty it had with the humidity, which she now understood from the inside, having learned it from a letter. Weeks later, after the formal proceedings had moved through their initial phase, after the 3 small affiliated operations whose funds had been redirected had been formally acknowledged within the cooperative structure, after Park of the Northern Waterfront membership had lifted the review with a call that was brief and somewhat chastened in tone, after the stalled real estate transaction had resumed with a consent that came in without condition, After Daehyun had prepared the formal documentation creating a new operational role titled Director of Trust and Protocol, with a scope of responsibility that covered every function Soo-yeon had been performing invisibly plus the functions she had been prevented from performing by the absence of a title. After all of that administrative movement had settled, Madame Jin drove back to the coast on a Sunday. She did not call ahead. Soo-yeon had not asked her not to call ahead, but something in the terms of the conditional arrangement they had struck suggested that announced visits were a form of performance, and that unannounced visits were a form of evidence, and Madame Jin was trying to produce evidence rather than performance. It was not a natural distinction for her to maintain. It required vigilance. She was attempting the vigilance. She parked on the same street, the same salt white light, different because the weeks had moved into the deeper part of autumn, and the angle was lower and more golden, the same small restaurant. Soo-yeon was not in the window. She was at the counter inside, talking with the restaurant's owner, and she looked up when the door opened, and she did not look surprised, which meant she had perhaps expected the attempt, or perhaps simply did not perform surprise. It was not possible to know which. Madame Jin was learning that about Soo-yeon, that a great deal of what Soo-yeon knew and felt was not performed for an audience, and therefore was not visible, and therefore had to be taken on trust. She sat at the same table. Soo-yeon brought 2 cups of tea without being asked, and sat down. Madame Jin placed the formal role documentation on the table. Soo-yeon read it without hurry. She read all of it, including the scope section, including the salary figure, including the language specifying direct organizational voice in any decision affecting the physical operations of Chungwon and the cooperative's access protocols. She read it the way she had presumably read everything she ever read, which was completely, then she set it down. She said, "You had this prepared." "Yes, before you drove out." "Yes, so you came to ask, not to tell," Madame Jin said. "Yes." Soo-yeon looked at her. She looked at her with the particular attention that had been Soo-yeon's most consistent practice and Madame Jin's most consistent object of ignorance, the attention that had watched the cooperative's members through 9 years of border booth meetings and cold coffee and questions asked before the asking, was expected. The attention that had watched a man named Woo Jin and noticed in October what he was doing and had said nothing to Madame Jin because Madame Jin had not been a person to whom Soo-yeon could bring a complicated thing and expect it to be held carefully. The attention that had watched Madame Jin herself, Madame Jin suspected with more precision than Madame Jin had ever applied to herself. "Do you know why I was at the diner at 3 in the morning?" Soo-yeon said. "On the last night I worked." Madame Jin had not known Soo-yeon had been there at 3. The letter had said she'd closed at 2. No, there was a young woman. She came in at 1:45. She'd been walking for a long time in the cold. She sat in the corner booth and ordered tea, and she was crying without sound, the way people cry when they've been crying alone long enough that they've stopped expecting anyone to see it. I sat with her until 3. I gave her food. I found out she was connected to one of the small operations that Woo Jin had been draining. Her family was one of the 3. She didn't know that. She just knew things were wrong, and she had nowhere to go at 2 in the morning except somewhere warm. Soo-yeon paused. "That is also why I built the ledger. Not only the principle of it, her. Specifically, I had a face." Madame Jin said nothing for a moment. The salt wind pressed against the window glass. The harbor beyond it was gray and very still. Then she said, "I want to be the kind of operation that would have known about her before she had to walk in from the cold." Soo-yeon said, "I know. That's new. Hold on to it." It was not a forgiveness. It was not a welcome back. It was a recognition that something true had been said and a caution not to lose it in the interval between saying and doing. The interval between saying and doing was where Madame Jin had historically lost most things that mattered. Soo-yeon knew this. Soo-yeon had watched it for 9 years from the floor of a diner while sealing a gap in a window with a piece of folded cardstock, because someone had to, and because someone was present, and because presence was the only practice Soo-yeon had ever trusted. Madame Jin slid the documentation across the table. She said, "Take it with you, read it again, think about it for as long as you need. I'll come back when you're ready to answer." Soo-yeon took the document and folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket and said, "Come back in 2 weeks, 2 weeks, not 2 days, not immediately." 2 weeks, which was a measurement of the interval between saying and doing, a defined distance in which Madame Jin was expected to sustain the thing she had said without the pressure of Soo-yeon's observation to maintain it. A test of whether the attention was genuine or performed. The kind of test that cannot be gamed because its entire premise is the absence of an audience. Madame Jin drove the 340 kilometers home in the dark. The road was nearly empty. The kilometer markers came and went. She had her hands on the wheel and the heater running and the radio off, and she was thinking about what it meant to pay attention to something, genuinely to pay attention, not to arrange it or manage it or position it, but to sit in its presence and ask what it needed and wait for the answer before deciding what it meant. She had been told 7 words on the first morning, and those 7 words had contained everything. You never watched how she watched everything. The wound was still there. She was not attempting to heal it by arriving. She was attempting, for perhaps the first time in 11 years, to let the wound stay unresolved long enough to teach her something rather than rushing to close it with a gesture. She pulled into the city after midnight. The waterfront streets were quiet. The diner was dark. She had a key in her coat pocket, and she stopped in front of it and looked at the window and felt the 340 kilometers of the round trip in her body. And she thought about the corner booth and the cold thread of air, and the woman who had sat in that booth at 3 a.m. crying without sound, and the woman behind the counter who had seen it and stayed. The attention, she thought, not the arrangement. The attention was the foundation. It had always been the foundation. She had built 11 years of structure on top of it without knowing it was there. The way a building is built on bedrock without the architect ever going down to see what the ground is made of. The bedrock had simply held, and then the bedrock had walked out, and the building had creaked, and here she was standing on the street in the dark outside her own diner, understanding for the first time what the ground was made of. She went inside. She made tea in the kitchen because she knew where the kettle was, and she had been in this kitchen many times, though never to make her own tea, and it took her a moment to locate the tea, which was in the 3rd cabinet above the prep counter behind the dry goods she recognized. She sat in the corner booth. She felt the cold immediately, the specific threat of it from the west window gap, and she looked, and the cardstock wedge was still on the ledge where Soo-yeon had left it. She picked it up. She pressed it into the gap in the window frame with a care that the small task deserved, which was the same care that Soo-yeon had brought to it for 7 winters, and she felt the draft stop. She drank her tea in the silence. 2 weeks. She would hold the thing she had said. She would hold it without being watched. She would make the 2 weeks evidence rather than performance, and at the end of them she would drive back to the coast and sit down and find out whether what she had said and what she had done had maintained their agreement with each other in the interval. The window was sealed now, the booth warming slowly, the pale celadon tile catching the low light from the kitchen. This was the building at its truth, she thought. Empty and working and warm in the places where someone had paid enough attention to seal what needed sealing. She did not know yet what she would build. She knew only that building something new was different from rebuilding what had been. Different in the specific way that knowledge is different from assumption, that attention is different from arrangement, that presence is different from performance. She had 11 years behind her. She had 2 weeks ahead. The 2 weeks were not nothing. They were, in fact, the beginning of the only honest construction she had ever attempted. And in that beginning, quiet and unwitnessed and smelling faintly of salt and tea in an empty diner at the edge of a winter night, there was something she had not expected and could not perform and therefore could not doubt. It was enough to start with. That was all it claimed to be.